So there are different responses that people have to the same drugs. In particular, there are a couple explanations on why people may behave differently on alcohol. One proposed explanation is the disinhibition in general and lack of impulse control. So there's research that indicates that the higher cognition areas, like the cortical areas of the brain, are more affected by alcohol as compared to the subcortical or more basic processing areas of the brain. So the idea is that when someone consumes alcohol, the basic areas of the brain are driving behavior more than the higher cognition areas. In particular, there's evidence that the frontal lobes, which are responsible, as you know, for decision making and reasoning, may be particularly affected even as compared to other lobes such as temporal and parietal. Another explanation is learning. So people have expectations for how they might act under the influence of alcohol. If people think that they're going to get in fights and get really emotional, things like this, when they're using alcohol, they're more likely to act in this way. In fact, there have been studies done where people are told that they're drinking alcohol and they're not, and they act in ways that they expect people under the influence of alcohol may act. Another explanation is behavioral myopia. So if someone is myopic, they're nearsighted. People under the influence of alcohol seem to respond to what's in front of them, so more immediate and salient information, while possibly ignoring longer term implications, more abstract implications of their actions, as well as more nuanced information. So they're not as able to kind of process more complicated information and sort of act within this more basic framework. A quick note, because I am relying heavily on the text for a lot of the material, your book does state that behavioral myopia can lead to risky behaviors due to lapses in judgment, and they included date rape in this. And I have to respectfully disagree with your book on this point. According to information from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, there isn't evidence that alcohol creates a judgment lapse in people who didn't already have a problematic view of sexual consent. And you're welcome to follow this link if you'd like to follow up on that. The idea is that research doesn't appear to indicate that someone has completely equitable and respectful views of sexual consent, drinks alcohol, and then commits date rape. It appears more that people who already have problematic views of sexual consent, so maybe don't fully respect sexual consent, are disinhibited by alcohol and therefore are more likely to commit something like date rape. Okay, so individual differences in addiction and dependence. In general, substance use is the pattern of use of a substance that is excessive and harmful due to the amount of the substance that is consumed. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is kind of the handbook for diagnosing mental disorder, doesn't actually distinguish between substance abuse and dependence any longer. So it's just different levels of substance use disorder that we diagnose anymore. Physical addiction is a physical dependence on a substance. So people that are physically addicted develop a tolerance where they need increased amounts of the drug to get the same effect. They experience withdrawal when they cut back or cease use of the substance. And there's also psychological addiction, which is a psychological need for a substance that isn't that isn't rooted necessarily in the purely physical effects of the drug. And you can look at this graphic up here to the right, showing harm caused by drugs is often harm caused by drugs is calculated based on the harm to the user and the harm to other people. And interestingly, alcohol, which is legal, is considered one of the most harmful drugs, especially in its harm to other people, which is kind of more proportional. More than half of the harm is harm to other people. Whereas heroin, which is highly addictive, is more likely to be harmful to the individual using it. And methamphetamine, extremely harmful to the individual using it, but not so harmful to others in general. Individuals have different responses to drugs, as I touched on earlier. So weight, height obviously can have an effect on how someone responds to a drug. Females may be more sensitive to certain drugs, as estrogen appears to interact with the addiction reward system in the central nervous system. In general, in terms of epidemiological studies, men are still more likely to abuse substances, and this is based on data from SAMHSA, which is kind of the main, one of the main funding and research agencies for mental health and substance abuse in the US. So if you look at this graphic, down at the bottom, men are more likely to abuse alcohol, and if you take, women are more likely to abuse, let's see, pain relievers, prescription pain relievers, and amphetamines. If you look at the numbers overall, men are a little bit more likely to abuse drugs based on treatment admissions. So it's possible that there's some chance that women have similar levels of addiction but are not as likely to seek treatment. It's possible. I don't think we necessarily have a final word on that. Older people are more sensitive to drugs in general. The same drug can have the same effect on older people. So for psychotropic medications, it can be important, or psychoactive medications, it can be important to make sure that age is taken into account. This is just a nice graphic showing social harm, likelihood for dependence, and physical harm so harm to the individual of different drugs. So it's interesting to see discrepancies between these three types of harm. So for example, tobacco has relatively high dependence compared to the physical and social harm it causes. Alcohol, again, appears to have relatively high social harm compared to level of dependence and the harm on the individual. Ketamine can cause relatively high harm to the individual compared to social harm and dependence, and heroin is just overall scary and terrible. There are several theories for why people use drugs, and the one that your book mentioned is this wanting and liking theory, which is supported by a fair amount of evidence. It's also called the incentive sensitizing theory, and this theory says that the desire for drug is elicited by cues associated for the drug. So the idea is like wanting, which is craving, is mediated by a different part of the brain as compared to liking, which is pleasure. So wanting is proposed to be mediated by the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, or the reward pathway, which is kind of what we think of also as like the addiction pathway. And then liking, which is the experience of pleasure, again, is mediated by the opioid systems. And this theory, the wanting and liking theory, suggests that people start taking the drug because it's pleasurable, it activates the opioid systems, but then it kind of hijacks this mesolimbic dopamine pathway, this reward pathway, and people continue taking it because of cravings rather than the actual pleasure that this drug provides. And this is backed up somewhat anecdotally by reports of people who have been addicted to drugs, especially highly addictive drugs such as heroin, who say that they don't so much enjoy, like the drug doesn't necessarily give them the same pleasure it did. They don't get the high that they used to, but they crave it and they need it, and they might also be using it to avoid the withdrawal symptoms, which can be extremely averse. So there's indication of different types of addiction, differences in the reward learning and learning of the association between the stimulus and reward, and these multiple forms of addiction are just based on Pavlovian classical conditioning. So if you remember, Pavlov gave a dog meat powder or something like that, and then rang a bell, and eventually the dog would salivate to the sound of the bell in anticipation of the meat powder, and it's an unconscious association where a previously neutral stimulus, such as the bell, becomes associated with a pleasurable stimulus, the meat powder. And so the proposal is that something similar is happening in addiction, at least for some people, and that there are variations in this type of classical conditioning that accounts for some individual differences in addiction behavior. So the two types are sign trackers and goal trackers, and this is a pretty broad generalization, but in general, for sign trackers, the cue stimulus is actually irresistible. So the dopamine pathway, this mesolimbic pathway, has been hijacked and is associated with a cue, such as maybe a syringe. And the cue is actually sought more than the actual drug. So the cue is sought in the absence of the pleasurable experience. So more than the effects of the drug is what I'm saying. So actually using the drug is more pleasurable than the effect of the drug. So for example, the person will find just the sight of the drug cue pleasurable. And again, this is supposed to be mediated by this dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway. The other type is goal trackers, where the cue stimulus is not as irresistible as in sign trackers, but rather they seek things that are more relevant to the actual pleasurable stimulus. So they won't find just drug cues as independently pleasurable, but will actually try to get the actual drugs. And this is believed to be not as heavily mediated by the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway. Due to cue salience, an important part of relapse prevention in drug treatment is avoiding having the client avoid the people, places, or things associated with drug use, and that can be really hard, especially in a place like Hawaii. It can be really hard to get away from your dealer, get away from friends that you might have used with. Even sometimes people have to end relationships where their partner was a drug user along with them. Even like moving to a new apartment or something, moving to a new neighborhood can be a really important part of avoiding relapse, because in part they're avoiding these cues. So the mesolimbic pathway, we've been talking about that a lot. To go into a bit of detail, it's this reward pathway, it's a dopaminergic pathway, and it's involved in the feeling of motivation and reward. So motivation to do something or to attain a certain reward. And it's not just involved in drugs, it's involved in a lot of different pleasurable experiences and motivation in general, but it's the part of the brain that appears to be dysregulated most heavily when somebody is addicted to drugs. So it's composed of these dopamine releasing neurons that project from the ventral tegmental area down here in the midbrain, or the VTA as it's often called, to the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the basal ganglia, and then that goes through to the prefrontal cortex as well, which, if you remember, is responsible for motivation, reasoning, all the higher level processes. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway also receives input from the hippocampus, which is associated with memory and learning. The amygdala, which you remember is associated with emotion, particularly strength of emotion. And then the medial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with memory formation, among other things. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway also includes glutamate and GABA neurons, so excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So you see there are kind of a lot of brain systems involved, even though it's mostly, or the primary function is dopamine transmission, but lots of different areas of the brain are involved, and a number of different neurotransmitter systems are involved as well. Importantly, susceptibility to drug abuse can have genetic components, and I think this is important to understand for a number of reasons. Some people who some of us who have not had addiction problems might find it difficult to understand how somebody can continue using drugs even if it ruins their life. And I think a big part of that is just having literally a different biological makeup, as well as different environmental influences. But the genetic component of drug abuse can be as much as 50% for nicotine, alcohol, and a number of other drugs. as is the case for most psychological disorders, genetic susceptibility to drug abuse is likely a combination of many different genes. Different gene combinations can have the same effect of making people more likely to be addicted to drugs. So it's not a matter of finding like the drug gene, it's lots of different genes and lots of different interactions between genes that give people more or less of a susceptibility to drug addiction. Epigenetics, unfortunately, can also affect the heritability of these genetic components. So if a parent uses a lot of drugs, that can reduce the expression of genes that are related to voluntary control, and they can pass on this reduction of expression of voluntary control genes, creating more problems with inhibition, behavioral inhibition, in their offspring. Oh, and notably, the genes involved in increased susceptibility to drug abuse might be related to learning, to dopamine, frontal lobe functioning, impulsivity, kind of all these components of drug use. Okay, so section 4, explaining and treating drug abuse. There's definitely indication that prolonged drug abuse can cause brain damage. In particular, growing brains are sensitive to drug abuse. So kids in general should just not use drugs, and certainly not habitually. The frontal lobe can be particularly affected by drug use, and the frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to stop developing, and development can continue into the 20s, possibly even to the 30s for males. So frontal lobe development is a little bit slower in males, and so can extend longer, even into the 30s. PCP, ketamine, and DXM, which, as we talked about before, create excessive glutamate transmission. Glutamate can trigger apoptosis or cell death, and so use of these drugs can actually kill cells in the brain, and will kill cells in the brain with extended use. MDMA or ecstasy, brain changes have been observed from long-time use. So MDMA is associated with excessive serotonin transmission, and can cause, with chronic use, can cause lesions in the serotonergic pathways, loss of gray matter, the neocortex, the really important part of the brain, can cause cognitive impairments and depression. So the dopamine parts of the brain get impaired, so there's not as much serotonin transmission, causing depression. And then methamphetamine can decrease dopamine transmission because it can damage the dopamine pathways, and as well make the dopamine pathways resistant to endogenous and natural transmission of dopamine. Some people with really long periods of methamphetamine use develop what is essentially the same as schizophrenia, so prolonged and chronic psychotic features, even when they abstain from methamphetamine. If you look on the right, you can see at the bottom right, brain recovery with prolonged abstinence from meth. So there is some indication that after long-term abstinence from meth, the brain can, this is dopamine transmission in the mesolimbic area of the brain, so the brain can recover and have normal dopamine transmission. However, with really intense and extended use, there can be permanent effects that are not reversible. And then up at the top, cortical gray matter volumes. This is showing that individuals who have long-term alcohol use, often we see reduction in gray matter volume. So brain matter is reduced, which is associated with cognitive and emotional issues. Another quick caveat to your text, there is a little box about drug-induced psychosis, in which the authors of your text described a case study where somebody experienced psychosis after using marijuana. A few issues with this. I study schizophrenia. I study schizophrenia specifically in young people. And many of my patients have used marijuana, and there's a big debate as to whether marijuana use can contribute to the onset of schizophrenia, and the data is extremely mixed and highly likely to be misinterpreted. So this particular case study in your book, as with any case study, it should not be overinterpreted. I think it was used as an example, but it should also not be interpreted by itself. In the main study that was cited, only individuals smoking cannabis with high THC had a higher occurrence of psychosis, and it was only a correlation. So as you hopefully know from Psych 100 and your psychology methods courses, correlations don't mean causation. You can never infer causation from correlations. So in the study, there was a correlation between psychotic symptoms in young people, or the incidence of schizophrenia in young people, and cannabis use, this high THC cannabis use. However, we can't prove that the cannabis use caused this. There's an alternative interpretation, which is that people who are at risk for psychosis might be more likely to use cannabis. And there's a number of reasons to believe that this interpretation may be valid. Cannabis has a sedating and anxiolytic effect, also an anxiolytic effect. And so people who are in the prodrome or pre-disease phase of psychosis are more likely to have anxiety and depression and may turn to drugs to deal with this. And there's also some indication that cannabidiol, as I think we mentioned or we talked about in a previous lecture, cannabidiol may have antipsychotic properties. So it's possible that people using certain strains of marijuana are attempting to glean antipsychotic properties from cannabis. It's not a good idea to use cannabis to deal with psychological problems, but it could be an explanation as to why there's this correlation between cannabis use and schizophrenia. So just restating that it's best for people with psychosis, certainly best for people with psychosis, and also just best for people with developing brains in general, to stay away from excessive cannabis use. However, it has not been proven by research, and there's been quite a bit of research on this, and it has not been proven that cannabis causes schizophrenia. Okay, so moving on to hormones. There are two main chemical classifications of hormones, and this is steroid hormones, which is just a steroid that acts as a hormone. This includes testosterone and cortisol. These steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol, and they're made in the gonads, the thyroid, and the adrenal glands, and they bind to steroid receptors. The other chemical classification is peptide hormones. This includes insulin, growth hormone, endorphins. This is made by DNA, cellular DNA, and it binds to metabatopic receptors that in turn influence second messengers, as you learned in the last chapter. And these second messengers set off chemical cascades that affect cell physiology and gene transcription. There's also functional classifications of hormones. So the chemical classification and functional classification, it's all the same hormones that we're talking about, it's just different ways to classify them. There's the homeostatic hormones, which, as the name suggests, maintain homeostasis in the body. Homeostasis just means like balancing, like keeps the body from not being too cold or too warm, etc. So these hormones are responsible for balance of metabolism, digestive functions. Insulin is one hormone that controls blood glucose levels. So if you know anyone who has diabetes, they might take insulin injections. And this is because the pancreas, which releases insulin, doesn't produce enough insulin in individuals with diabetes, and so their blood sugar can spike and plummet, and so they may inject insulin into their body to help them maintain and regulate blood sugar levels. Hunger and eating are also regulated by hormones. Leptin is secreted by fat tissue, and this hormone inhibits hunger. And then conversely, ghrelin, which is secreted by the gastrointestinal tract, induces hunger. So these two hormones kind of act in opposition to each other. They're called the hunger hormones. Ghrelin is secreted when the stomach is empty, among other things. Low levels of ghrelin in individuals, low levels of ghrelin have been found in people with anorexia. So they might literally just not feel as hungry. And then higher levels have been found, higher than normal levels have been found in individuals, especially children with obesity. Both leptin and ghrelin signal the hypothalamus directly. Gonadal or sex hormones perform a lot of reproductive functions, create sex-specific phenotypes, so like the gonads or the genitals, and also sex-specific phenotypes like breasts in women and bigger hips and bigger like shoulders and arms in men. They have an effect on the brain and body development as actually before people are even born. So there's a possible influence of prenatal sex hormones on sexual orientation. There's indication that females who are exposed to high levels of testosterone in utero are less likely to be purely heterosexual. There's also some indication that males who are exposed to lower levels of testosterone are more likely to be homosexual as well. One kind of interesting indication of prenatal exposure to testosterone is the ratio between the second and the fourth digit. So the second digit is the pointer finger, and the fourth digit is the index finger. And as the length of your fingers is determined in the womb, this has been pretty strongly correlated with exposure to testosterone in the womb. And so there's been a number of findings that a more feminized or a 2 to 4 digit ratio that's more associated with lower levels of testosterone is equal length of the second and fourth digits. So if you look at the graphic on the right, in women, this is associated with lower, higher fertility, higher risk of breast cancer, lower levels of autism. Autism is associated with higher levels of testosterone, and lower levels of ADHD. ADHD is also associated with, ADHD is more commonly diagnosed in males. In men, this 2 to 4 digit ratio, if the 2 to 4 digit ratio is indicative of lower testosterone in the womb, they also have lower levels of autism, lower fertility, and lower testosterone levels as adults. If there's a more masculinized 2 to 4 digit ratio, men are more aggressive, have a higher tendency toward alcohol, which might be because of impulsivity. They have better athletic ability, which is also associated with higher testosterone in general, a more promiscuous, higher number of sexual partners, and similarly in women, more promiscuous or more likely to have more sexual partners. Interestingly, more likely to be anorexic or bulimic. Higher levels of homosexuality, which we would, again, has been associated with prenatal levels of testosterone exposure, higher testosterone exposure in females. Puberty is delayed, and women who have this masculinized 2 to 4 digit ratio are also more likely to be athletic. There's a ton of studies about this. People are really, really into this 2 to 4 digit ratio and what it correlates with. Just be careful if you look online about it. Just be careful about your sources. Make sure you're getting reliable sources. So sex hormones also, this is a highly contentious subject, but do appear to have some influence on cognition. And of course, as with any population studies, this is on average. It doesn't mean in all cases women have certain advantages. It doesn't mean all women are better at these things and all males are worse, or the other way around. Any study of gender differences is always confounded by environmental effects, and the effect sizes for these cognitive differences in general is rather small. So males in general have appear to have advantages in some spatial abilities, specifically the mental rotation of a 3D object. And then females, on average, appear to have advantages in some verbal abilities. Okay, so the next functional group of hormones is the glucocorticoids, and this is steroid hormones. They're secreted during stress, and cortisol is kind of the most commonly known one of these. Notably, stress can be good or bad. So you might have learned about this in like Psych 100. Eustress is like good stress, so stress that helps you perform better, maybe is like activating. And then distress is bad stress, stress that might kind of inhibit you from being productive. Things like this might be really, really uncomfortable. There are two main types of stress responses in the body. There's the fast response, which is the fight or flight response, and this is mediated primarily by epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And then there's the slow response, which is mediated mostly by cortisol. Extended or excessive stress response can be damaging to the brain and the body as well. So stress responses use a lot of energy, proteins in the body that could have been used for other things. Stress inhibits growth hormones, so there are studies where kids who are in very stressful environments just don't thrive as much. They don't grow physically or cognitively as much as their less stressed cohorts. Stress inhibits digestion, and it inhibits immune functioning. So if you ever felt like you are more likely to get sick the more stressed you are, this is probably true. And then stress response, there's a high indication that it damages the hippocampus, which, if you remember, is one of the main areas implicated in memory functioning. So it can impede memory functioning. There's studies showing that people with PTSD have increased cortical response in response to daily stressors. So they're kind of, people with PTSD in general are just, their body is more ready to respond to stressful situations, possibly because of their past traumas. And so they have increased activation of these stress areas, or these pathways in the body and the brain that are that mediate stress. Okay, and finally we have the anabolic androgenic steroids. So also just known as anabolic steroids. These are synthetic hormones that are chemically similar to testosterone. They have anabolic, which is like muscle building effects. So athletes will use them. They're typically illegal, but athletes will sometimes use them to enhance muscle building and athletic abilities. And they also have androgenic or masculinizing effects. So they will increase like masculine features. They're used medically for testosterone replacement in men. So some men have like low testosterone, so they can be used to sort of replace this testosterone, and also for the treatment of endometriosis in females. There's this form, there's a particular anabolic steroid that is being studied right now as possible male birth control. Females often take hormones to prevent pregnancy in themselves, and there's indication that there may be hormone regulation for men too that would, among other things, suppress sperm production. And this would be reversible, so that if they, just like for women, they can stop taking birth control and get pregnant, for men they would be able to stop taking this steroid, and sperm production, it appears, would return to normal. Anabolic steroids are also used for male to female gender transitions, and here's a video of showing like a 1-year transition of a woman who was on anabolic steroids among a number of other things, who transitioned to male gender, or at least went through the physical transition to male gender at that point. And you can see up top here on the right is someone who went through that transition as well, who was born a female and went through to a male gender transition.